Michaela Cloth. There are arguments that simmer for years before they erupt. Arguments rooted in years of resentment, accumulated wounds, and slowly eroding patience. And then there are arguments that begin over nothing, over the most ordinary, forgettable domestic friction imaginable, and end in a way that no one who loved the people involved could ever have prepared for. The second kind is somehow harder to process. Because if something this catastrophic can be triggered by something this small, then the danger was never really about the argument at all. Michaela Cloth was 27 years old, living in the Lac La Belle area of Waukesha County, Wisconsin. Lucas John Roche was 25, and by all accounts, he was one of those people whose warmth was immediately apparent to everyone around him. His family described him as the most loving, giving, kind-hearted person anyone could ever meet. Someone who was a devoted son, a caring brother, a special uncle, and a dog dad who poured genuine affection into every corner of his life. He and Michaela had been together for approximately 3 years. 3 years of shared evenings, shared plans, shared ordinary life. And on the evening of April 24th, 2026, he drove to her apartment on Wisconsin Avenue in the village of Lac La Belle with chicken drumsticks, seasoning, and the simple intention of cooking dinner in her air fryer. He never came home. To understand what happened that night, it helps to understand what had already been building in the weeks before it. Lucas had apparently sensed something in the relationship that went beyond ordinary tension. 1 week before the stabbing, he had a conversation with another woman and with his apartment landlord that stopped them cold. He asked that his full name be recorded, formally documented, because something in him felt the need to leave a paper trail. He said he was afraid. He said that in case something ever happened to him, he wanted people to know he was and who was in his life. That is not the language of someone who felt minor discomfort in a relationship. That is the language of someone who recognized on some level that the person he was still connected to was capable of serious harm. What had prompted that fear just days earlier was a physical altercation. Michaela had bitten his thumb. The witness who heard his account described him as genuinely frightened, not frustrated, not annoyed, afraid. And yet Lucas still came to her apartment that Friday evening, carrying groceries, hoping for a normal night. Because that is what people in complicated relationships do. They keep trying, they keep showing up. They absorb the fear and return because the alternative, the full acknowledgement of what they are dealing with, feels too heavy to carry all at once. On the night of April 24th, 2026, the argument began over dinner. Lucas wanted to cook using Michaela's air fryer. Michaela wanted to go out, to a bar, to a restaurant, somewhere other than the apartment. That was the friction. That was the disagreement that would be documented in a criminal complaint, presented in a courtroom, and remembered by Lucas's family for the rest of their lives. Michaela told investigators that Lucas was pushing her buttons. That phrase, pushing her buttons, carries with it the weight of something already stretched beyond its tolerance point. Whatever resentment or rage was sitting beneath that evening's argument had not been born that night. It had been building. The dinner dispute was not the cause. It was the match. At some point during that argument, Michaela picked up a kitchen knife and drove it once into Lucas's chest. One strike, a single, decisive action that took approximately a heartbeat to execute and approximately 30 years of a family's future to destroy. When officers arrived at the apartment, they found Lucas on the floor with a puncture wound to the chest. The weapon, a kitchen knife, was at the scene, and Michaela was still there. She did not run. She did not hide. She looked at the officers and told them immediately, without hesitation, that she had done it. She said she was angry. She said it plainly. The way someone states a fact they have no energy left to manage or soften. What she said during the ride to the police station is perhaps the most devastating window into the emotional landscape she was operating in. She expressed regret, not primarily about Lucas, not about what she had done to him or his family, but about the missed opportunity to go to the bar instead. She wondered aloud whether Lucas's parents would now hate her. She told officers that if they needed to lock her up, that was cool. The casualness of those words, the lightness with which she seemed to be, processing the fact that she had just fatally wounded the man she had been with for 3 years, spoke to something deeply, troublingly absent. Lucas was transported to a hospital. He did not survive. The injuries from the single stab wound were unsurvivable. He died at 25 years old, a young man whose family would later stand in a courtroom and use the words "completely broken" to describe what his loss had done to them. They asked for privacy. They did not dress the grief in statistics or policy language. They simply said he was the most loving person they knew and that he was gone. Michaela was charged with first-degree intentional homicide on April 27, 2026. Her initial court appearance set bail at $2 million cash, a figure that reflected the severity of the charge and the directness of the evidence. The case against her rested on a foundation of physical evidence, scene documentation, and her own immediate, unprompted confession. There was no ambiguity about who had held the knife. There was no mystery to be solved. The investigation was swift precisely because Michaela had not attempted to construct a lie. She had stated what she had done and appeared, in those first hours, to regard the consequences as something she could simply absorb. The preliminary hearing established probable cause with little difficulty. A Lac La Belle police detective testified to the evidence and Michaela's admissions. She was bound over for trial. An arraignment was scheduled for July 15, 2026, before Circuit Court Judge Michael Maxwell. As of the time of this account, the trial has not yet concluded, and Michaela remains in pretrial custody in Waukesha County, held on the $2 million bond. She faces a potential life sentence if convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, a charge that in Wisconsin carries no possibility of the death penalty, as the state abolished capital punishment in 1853. What the trial will ultimately determine is whether what happened in that apartment on April 24th was intentional in the legal sense that the charge demands. Prosecutors are expected to lean heavily on the admission, the single deliberate strike, and Lucas's documented fear from the week prior as evidence of intent. The defense may explore the emotional context of the relationship, the argument, and Michaela's state of mind. But the admission, clear, immediate, and unambiguous, is not something that evaporates under cross-examination. Lucas Roche was 25 years old. He brought chicken drumsticks and seasoning to a woman he had been with for 3 years. He sat down somewhere in that apartment and got into an argument about where to eat dinner, and then he was gone. His family did not get a warning. They did not get a phone call that gave them time to reach him before the worst happened. They got the news that the most loving person they knew had been taken from them in the most ordinary setting imaginable, over the most forgettable domestic disagreement a person could construct. That is the particular cruelty at the center of this case. Not that it was monstrous in its complexity, but that it was so devastatingly, irreversibly simple. Vegas Bray. Some people break when a relationship ends. The grief is real, the disorientation is genuine, and the impulse to reach back towards something that felt safe is entirely human. Most people, though, find a way through. They lean on friends. They allow time to do its work. They eventually release what is no longer theirs to hold. And then there are the rare, frightening few who cannot let go. Not because the love is too deep, but because something else entirely is driving the pursuit. Something darker. Something that has very little to do with love and everything to do with control. Vegas Bray was born in 1988 in San Diego, California, and grew up in circumstances that left her, by the time she reached adulthood, carrying wounds that had never been properly treated. She had grown up without her father. Her mother had abandoned her. She had been subjected to abuse as a child. By the time she was a young adult, she had been diagnosed with depression and PTSD, conditions for which she was receiving disability status. She had joined the United States Navy after high school, where she worked in a machine shop, and where she met Victor Saucedo, the man whose life she would eventually take. In the early telling of Vegas's life, there is nothing that looks like a trajectory toward violence. She was described by people who knew her as attractive, sociable, and academically capable. She had friends. She had a life with structure in it. But the childhood wounds she carried had never healed. And when a relationship offered her something that felt like security and belonging, the terror of losing it was not something she had the tools to manage. Vegas and Victor began a relationship around March of 2011. Victor was a Navy veteran, a damage control man who had served his country and was now trying to build a civilian life. He had a young son, roughly 4 to 7 years old at the time, and he was committed to being a present, devoted father. He was described by friends and family as charismatic, warm, and well-liked, the kind of person whose company made a room feel lighter. The relationship with Vegas lasted several months before it ended, reportedly because of her intense jealousy, particularly toward the mother of Victor's child. When Victor tried to move on, Vegas did not. Over the course of approximately a year following the breakup, Vegas launched what can only be described as a sustained campaign of harassment. She slashed at his tires, she egged his car, she appeared at his locations without warning. When he moved apartments, she found him. She threw objects through windows. She smeared things across his door. She tracked his movements with a persistence that communicated, clearly and repeatedly, that his desire to create distance was something she had decided not to honor. Victor reported the incidents to police. He was not taken seriously in the way he deserved to be. The gender dynamics at play, a woman stalking a man, appeared to work against him in the moment when the system should have intervened most decisively. At one point, Victor allegedly woke to find Vegas sitting on his chest while holding a weapon. Think carefully about what that image means. She had gotten into his home, found him while he slept, and positioned herself above him in a posture of complete physical dominance, not as a gesture of affection, but as a demonstration of access. She could reach him whenever she chose. She wanted him to know that. And yet the full gravity of the danger he was in did not translate into meaningful protection. Months before the murder, Vegas purchased a revolver. On the night of October 15, 2012, Vegas and Victor spent time together drinking. They had sex. The next morning, Victor declined her request to go to breakfast together. He told her no. That refusal, that simple, ordinary act of a man deciding he did not want to share a meal, was the final trigger. Vegas reportedly expressed anger about feeling used. She left, and then she came back. She returned to Victor's Imperial Beach apartment on October 16, 2012, carrying a loaded, .38 caliber revolver loaded with hollow point bullets. She entered his apartment and she shot him. Witnesses heard the shots, then a pause, then more shots. That pause is one of the most chilling details in the forensic record of this case. Her revolver held 6 rounds. She fired them, paused, reloaded, and kept firing. Victor would have shot 9 times in total, in the head, in the chest, and once through his hand, a wound that forensic investigators identified as defensive. He had raised his hand trying to protect himself. After the shooting, Vegas called 911 and told the operator that Victor had shot himself. She claimed suicide. She remained at the scene, composed enough to make the call, composed enough to construct a narrative on the spot. Investigators who arrived quickly recognized the inconsistency between the claimed cause of death and the physical evidence. The number of wounds, their distribution, the defensive injury, and the clear evidence of reloading all indicated homicide. Vegas's claim collapsed within hours. During questioning, she claimed a blackout. She said she could not remember the shooting and attributed her actions to childhood trauma and what she described as an alter ego. Her half-brother testified at trial that she had called him after the shooting to say goodbye, that she had been on the verge of harming herself before he talked her out of it. That call was a critical piece of the prosecution's puzzle, linking her directly to the scene and demonstrating consciousness of what she had done. Investigators also uncovered notes and a written list that referenced killing Victor. The stalking history, documented through prior police reports, formed a timeline of escalating obsession. The purchase of the revolver months before the killing spoke to premeditation rather than impulse. The defense worked hard at trial to argue diminished capacity, leaning on her diagnosed PTSD, her trauma history, and the blackout claim. Vegas had outbursts in the courtroom. She denied being jealous. She denied agency in the act. The jury did not accept it. In November 2015, Vegas Bray was convicted of first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. On January 8, 2016, she was sentenced to 50 years to life, 25 to life for the murder, plus a consecutive 25 to life for the firearm use. She was 27 years old at sentencing. She will not be eligible for parole until approximately 2066, when she will be around 78 years old. Victor Saucedo's son was left without his father. A child who had done nothing wrong except be born to a man another person decided to possess. At sentencing, family members spoke of a boy who missed his hero, a boy who reportedly wished he could build a time machine and go back to prevent the day his father ever crossed paths with Vegas Bray. That wish, pure and heartbroken and entirely impossible, is the lasting emotional weight of this case. Not the trial, not the 50-year sentence, just a child who wanted his father back and had no way to get there. Victor Saucedo deserved to be taken seriously when he reported the harassment. He deserved protection when a woman was entering his home uninvited. He deserved to say no to breakfast without paying for it with his life. And the system that was supposed to protect him failed him, quietly, bureaucratically, invisibly, until there was nothing left to protect. Jahara Malik. There are crimes that emerge from long calculated plans, crimes assembled piece by piece over weeks or months, where every step reveals a deliberate, conscious decision to move toward harm. And then there are crimes that happen in an instant, where a life is present, and then in a single unthinking moment it is not. The second kind does not carry any less devastation than the first. It does not leave any less grief in its wake. But it asks a different set of questions. Questions about impulse, about what we put in the hands of teenagers, about what happens when emotional volatility and a concealed weapon occupy the same space at the same time. Jahara Malik was 17 years old, growing up in Miami, Florida, in the winter of 2024. Yakim Lola, known to his family and teammates as Chemo, was also 17. He was a junior and a star football player at Miami Northwestern Senior High School, a young man who loved the game, loved his family, and had begun to build the quiet, specific dreams that belong to teenagers who are still deciding what kind of person they want to become. He wanted a career in finance. He had a future that stretched outward in multiple directions, full of possibility. He had parents who adored him, a family that orbited around him, and a community that knew his name on the field. He and Jahara had been in a relationship, the kind of on and off dynamic that is common in adolescence, cycling through closeness and distance, and back again as teenagers try to navigate emotions that often feel too large for the containers they are still developing. By early December of 2024, the relationship had reached another ending. Chemo had reportedly attempted to end things roughly 8 days before the incident. He had tried to create a boundary. He had tried to close a chapter. Jahara was not ready for that chapter to close. On December 20th, 2024, Jahara went to the apartment complex where Chemo lived, near Northwest 6th Court and 61st Street in Miami. She had been out shopping with a friend earlier that day. She had reached for her usual pepper spray before leaving and found she did not have it. Instead, she took a 4-inch knife. That decision, to carry a blade because the other option was unavailable, is one of the most quietly alarming details in this case. It suggests a young woman who had normalized the idea of carrying something capable of causing serious harm as a routine precaution, not as a weapon, as a just-in-case. Prosecutors would later note that this was not the first time Jahara had put a knife in the context of interpersonal conflict. There had been a prior incident involving knife-related behavior described as horseplay. There had been a recorded threat made to another ex-boyfriend. 3 words that prosecutors would later present to the court as evidence of a pattern. I want blood. These details did not make Jahara a calculated predator, but they did paint a portrait of a teenager whose relationship with conflict and with sharp objects had already moved into territory that warranted serious attention and had not received it. In the parking garage of Chemo's building, the 2 teenagers met. Surveillance footage captured the earlier moments, the way they moved, the body language of a conversation happening in a space already charged with the emotional residue of a breakup. What began, Jahara would later say, as play fighting or horseplay, 2 teenagers who had loved each other doing what teenagers sometimes do in moments of tension, pushing and deflecting through physical proximity rather than direct conversation, ended with the knife. She was carrying it at some point in that garage, in a moment that no one can fully reconstruct because the surveillance footage captured the aftermath rather than the precise instant. The blade entered Chemo's chest. Once, a single wound to the chest. Chemo backed away, bleeding. He called out. He sought help. Jahara dropped the knife, Her friend, who was nearby, witnessed the chaos of those first moments. Responders were called. Kimo was transported to a hospital, still alive, still fighting. He died the following day, December 21st, 2024. He was 17 years old. He had tried to end a relationship 8 days earlier. He had not tried to end his life. When police arrived at the scene, Jahara spoke with blood on her hands. She told officers it had been accidental, that they were play fighting, that he had run into the knife, that she had not meant for any of this to happen. She was cooperative and visibly shaken. The claim of accident was consistent with her affect in those first moments. But prosecutors would later argue that intent does not require a plan announced in advance. It can live in the choice to carry a knife into an emotionally charged confrontation and engage in physical contact with it in your possession. Kimo's family found that framing insufficient. They stood in a courtroom and said so with a grief so raw it altered the air in the room. His parents, Natalie and David Lawler, described choosing a casket for their son just before Christmas. They described the specific cruelty of that timing, the holidays arriving as the worst news of their lives arrived alongside them. His aunt addressed Jahara directly in a statement that left no ambiguity about the family's feelings. The word she used was demon seed. It was the language of a parent's absolute anguish, not a legal argument, but it communicated the bottomless depth of what had been lost. In March of 2026, Jahara pleaded guilty to manslaughter and carrying a concealed weapon. She did not enter a plea deal. She pled open, allowing Judge Christine Hernandez to determine the sentence without a negotiated cap. At the sentencing hearing on May 5, 2026, both families testified. Jahara apologized. She acknowledged recklessness. She did not claim complete innocence. Prosecutors sought 20 years in prison plus 10 years of probation. The defense emphasized her age, her remorse, and her capacity for rehabilitation. Judge Hernandez sentenced Jahara to 17 years in Florida State Prison, followed by 5 years of reporting probation. The sentence also included a mental health evaluation and a requirement that she write annual letters, reflecting on the crime's impact on Kimo's family, 1 letter each year on the anniversary of his death. Kimo's family did not find closure in the sentence. They believed it was insufficient. They believed the charge itself, manslaughter rather than murder, had not fully honored the permanence of what was done to their son. They said that Kimo could now rest in peace, but the phrasing carried exhaustion in it, the kind that comes not from resolution but from the recognition that the legal system had offered its answer and the family would now have to learn to live alongside it. Jahara Malik is serving her 17-year sentence in Florida State Prison. She will have spent a significant portion of her young adulthood behind bars by the time she is eligible for release, at which point she will face 5 additional years of supervised probation. She was 17 when she put a knife in her pocket and went to see a boy who had tried to say goodbye to her. Kimo was 17 when he bled in a parking garage and died the following morning. 2 teenagers, 1 irreversible morning, and a family that will write Kimo's name on their hearts for the rest of their lives, long after every camera has moved on. Ana Trujillo. Some relationships carry the appearance of passion while hiding something far more dangerous underneath. From the outside, they look like love, intense, consuming, alive. But what masquerades as devotion can sometimes be a storm waiting to make landfall. Quiet in its early stages, catastrophic when it finally breaks. The most alarming truth about intimate partner violence is that it often comes from the last direction anyone expects. Ana Trujillo was 44 years old, originally from Mexico, and living in Houston, Texas. She was outgoing, vibrant, and known in local social circles as a woman who loved a good night out. Her boyfriend, Dr. Alf Stefan Andersson, was 59, a Swedish-born biochemist and research professor at the University of Houston. Stefan had moved to the United States in 1986 and built a quiet, deeply respected academic life over nearly 3 decades. His colleagues remembered him as intellectually generous and genuinely kind. His family described a man who was slow to anger and patient to a fault. He was, by every account, the last person who deserved what was coming. Their relationship was volatile from the start. It was the kind of dynamic where breaking up and getting back together felt like a rhythm neither could escape. Anna and Stefan had cycled through separations before, always finding their way back to one another through a combination of emotional pull and unresolved feelings. Those close to Stefan later admitted they had harbored quiet fears about the relationship. Something in the pattern worried them. But Stefan kept returning, and so the cycle continued. He had reportedly chosen her again and again, despite everything the pattern was quietly warning him about. That is what people do when they love someone. They override the signals. They hope the next time will be different. On the evening of June 8, 2013, the couple spent time at a neighborhood bar near Stefan's Museum District apartment in Houston. By the time they returned to his high-rise unit in the early morning hours of June 9th, the alcohol and accumulated tension had reached a breaking point. An argument ignited. Anna would later claim that Stefan became furious when she rejected his attempts to reconcile. She alleged that he chased her through the apartment, threw her into walls, and attacked her in a prolonged struggle lasting close to an hour. She framed everything that followed as self-defense, the desperate act of a woman fighting for her life against a man who wanted to hurt her. But what the physical evidence revealed was far more telling than any verbal account. When investigators examined both individuals at the scene, the findings were striking in their clarity. Anna had no significant injuries, not a scratch, bruise, or mark consistent with the kind of extended, violent assault she described. Stefan, however, had wounds on his hands and wrists, the unmistakable pattern of someone who had spent their final moments trying to shield themselves from an onslaught of blows. He was not the aggressor. He was the one trying to survive. The weapon Anna used was her own shoe, a blue suede platform pump with a 5.5-inch stiletto heel, and in a detail almost too painful to absorb, reportedly a gift from Stefan himself, valued at roughly $1,500. Prosecutors argued that after Stefan fell or was knocked to the floor, Anna climbed on top of him, pinning him down with her body weight to prevent him from moving or protecting himself. She then removed that shoe. And what followed was not a momentary act of panic. It was prolonged. It was forceful. It was relentless. She brought the pointed heel down on him repeatedly, targeting his face and his neck, striking him at least 25 distinct times. Forensic analysts described the wound pattern as resembling Swiss cheese, so concentrated and repetitive were the impacts. The heel punctured skin and tissue with each blow, causing massive bleeding. Blood spatter at the scene was consistent with overhead strikes delivered to a person already on the ground, already unable to fight back meaningfully. And yet she kept going. That is the detail that the courtroom evidence forced everyone to sit with. Stefan was on the floor. He had defensive wounds on his hands from trying to block the blows. He was not a threat. He was a man bleeding, trying to survive, and the person above him did not stop. After the attack, Anna called 911. She told police she had struck him only a couple of times, claiming she did not realize the gravity of what had happened until she saw the blood. She said she attempted to help him, that she tried CPR, but Stefan Anderson never regained consciousness. Paramedics arrived to find him beyond saving. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 59 years old. He had spent decades building a life rooted in learning, generosity, and quiet dignity. And it ended on the floor of his own apartment, at the hands of a woman he had once loved enough to buy a gift for, the very gift that became the instrument of his death. The case immediately attracted national media attention, largely because of the nature of the weapon. Headlines dubbed Anna the Stiletto Killer, a sensationalized label that perhaps inadvertently undercut the gravity of what had actually been lost. A man's life, a family's irreplaceable person, a university community's beloved colleague. At trial in April 2014 in Harris County, Texas, Anna's defense team leaned heavily into a narrative of domestic abuse and sudden passion. They argued she had been victimized for years, and that she acted in self-preservation on that terrifying night. They sought a sentence in the 2 to 20-year range under Texas law, portraying her as a battered woman who finally broke under extreme fear. The prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. They called witnesses who testified about Anna's prior violent behavior toward another, former partner, attacks that had reportedly come without any meaningful provocation. They pointed to the absence of injuries on her body. They emphasized Stefan's defensive wounds. They highlighted what Anna had said and had not said. during her 911 call. She never once expressed fear for her life during that call. She never described being attacked. The terror she claimed to have felt was conspicuously absent from the one moment where it should have been most loudly present. It was that silence, that gap between her story and her behavior, that told the jury everything. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before reaching a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase took 4 hours. They imposed the maximum, life in prison. One juror later described Anna as scary crazy, a raw, unfiltered expression of how thoroughly the defense's portrait of a frightened, abused woman had collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Anna appealed in 2015, arguing ineffective counsel and other procedural grounds. The appeal was denied. She is currently incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, with parole eligibility not scheduled until 2043. Stefan Anderson had done nothing wrong on that June night, except perhaps love someone who was incapable of receiving it safely. His family had to watch the man they loved be reduced to forensic exhibits and courtroom arguments. His colleagues had to sit in the knowledge that one of the gentlest people in their professional world spent his final moments on a floor, trying to block blows from a shoe he had once purchased as a token of affection. And yet, within the grief, there was eventually a verdict. A jury looked at the evidence, looked at the story Anna told, and chose the truth over the performance. For Stefan, it came too late. But for the record, for history and accountability, justice ultimately did arrive. Samantha Krebs. Some of the most dangerous relationships are the ones that look, from the outside, like two people simply destroying each other slowly, both struggling, both in pain. But when the dust settles and the final accounting is made, it becomes clear that the destruction was never equal, that one person was pulling the other deeper into a darkness they could not escape, and that the endgame was always going to be devastating for the one who trusted most. Samantha Krebs was 40 years old, living in Appleton, Wisconsin, with her boyfriend and fiancé Joey Carno, who was 35. Their relationship was, by the time of the events of July 2024, a portrait of everything addiction can do to two human beings who once might have chosen each other for better reasons. Both were using methamphetamine. Both were cycling through the particular volatility that comes with that kind of dependence. But those around Joey noticed something that worried them deeply. He appeared to be deteriorating. His physical appearance had changed visibly. His behavior had shifted. His family watched it happening and could not stop it. And according to at least one account, Joey had expressed directly that he feared Samantha might one day harm him. That fear, it turned out, was not unfounded. Samantha had a history that should have been alarming to anyone paying close attention. By the time of the crime, she had accumulated 20 prior cases and 37 convictions, a record spanning drug possession across multiple substances, battery, weapons charges, and a long pattern of dishonesty with law enforcement. She was on probation when Joey died. She had been cycling through the justice system for over a decade, and nothing, no sentence, no supervision, no consequence, had corrected her trajectory. Prosecutors would later describe her as a cold-hearted manipulator who had pulled Joey deeper into destructive drug culture while presenting herself as a partner. His family watched the deterioration with growing alarm. They watched the man they loved become less recognizable with every passing month, and they watched him stay. Because that is what people sometimes do when the person holding them down is also the person they love. What the jury and the courtroom ultimately had to reckon with was not just what Samantha did on July 18, 2024. It was the context, it was the weight of the relationship, the power dynamic, the documented history of threats and violence. The picture of someone who had spent years tightening her grip on a man who wanted to get free but couldn't find the door. On that July morning, in the kitchen of their shared apartment on North Park Drive Lane in Appleton, an argument erupted between them. Both were under the influence of methamphetamine. Prosecutors argued the confrontation escalated to a breaking point. At some moment in that kitchen, Samantha took a knife and drove it once into Joey's chest. The blade punctured his heart. He collapsed to the floor of the room where they cooked meals and shared mornings, and he died there. The medical examiner would later confirm the single stab wound to the chest as the cause of death. One deliberate strike to the heart was all it took. What followed next is the part that sat most heavily with everyone who heard the evidence. Samantha did not call for help. She did not reach for a phone, did not dial emergency services, did not do the one thing that might possibly have given Joey a fighting chance. Instead, she waited. At some point, friends arrived, alerted by missed calls from her phone. When they walked in, they found Joey wounded on the floor. And Samantha was there, present and composed enough to do something extraordinary. She leaned down and kissed Joey goodbye. She told him she was sorry. She told him she loved him. And then she turned to the arriving friends and instructed them, clearly and deliberately, to tell police that Joey had stabbed himself. She staged his death as a suicide. And then she walked out the door and fled the apartment before police arrived. When investigators later reached her by phone, her stories shifted in incompatible directions. She claimed she had left around 7 in the evening. She implied she learned of Joey's death through a newspaper. She suggested he had become crazy after she departed. Each version she offered introduced new contradictions. Surveillance footage tracked her actual movements. Clothing items matched her locations. The physical evidence at the scene did not align with self-infliction, and no blood appeared in certain areas of the apartment where it would have been present had Joey carried out the act himself. The forensic and witness evidence converged, piece by piece, on a single unavoidable conclusion. At trial in September 2025, Samantha took the stand in her own defense and denied everything. She maintained that the injury was self-inflicted or accidental. The jury deliberated for more than 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree intentional homicide. They had heard the witness accounts from the friends who arrived that night. They had considered the forensic findings, the surveillance records, and the documented history of prior violence and threats. The defense's self-infliction theory simply could not withstand the cumulative weight of the evidence against it. At sentencing on November 25, 2025, Joey's family delivered impact statements that left very little to the imagination about what the loss had cost them. They described watching the man they loved be consumed by a relationship that systematically dismantled everything good in him. They asked the court to deny any possibility of future release. Judge Vincent Biskupic sentenced Samantha to life in prison, with eligibility for extended supervision, Wisconsin's equivalent of parole, after 36 years. The judge criticized her addiction history and her chronic dishonesty. He called parts of her account at sentencing window dressing. He noted pointedly the jail calls in which she had apparently laughed, a detail that told the court more about her remorse than any prepared statement could. Joey Carno was 35 years old. He had people who loved him and hoped for better for him. He ended up on his kitchen floor, and the woman who kissed him goodbye while he was dying went to prison not broken by what she had done, but already planning her next argument in court. Devin Michaels. When a family fractures across multiple generations, when the lines between parent, partner, and rival blur into something unrecognizable, the dysfunction that results can take on a life entirely its own. It doesn't announce itself clearly. It hides behind labels like convenience and co-parenting and complicated until the day it stops hiding and reveals its true weight. And when that day comes, it tends to come with a force that destroys everything around it. Devin Michaels was a former adult film actress, 45 or 46 years old at the time of the events of August 6th and 7th, 2023. Jonathan Willett was 46, the father of her 2 young daughters and her former romantic partner. Their relationship had been over for years, at least romantically. The two had not been intimate since 2018, according to trial testimony. But the entanglement between them had never fully resolved, and, by the summer of 2023, it was approaching a collision that no one who loved either of them could have anticipated. What made this case extraordinary was the depth of the relational complexity surrounding it. Devin had married Deviere Willett, Jonathan's adult son from a previous relationship, in 2021. Both described the marriage publicly as one of convenience entered into for insurance benefits. But evidence presented at trial told a different story. There had been a long-term intimate relationship between Devin and Deviere, one that had begun when Deviere was around 19 and had deepened by late 2022. Phone records, text messages, and communications between the two supported what the convenience marriage label had been carefully obscuring for years. In this arrangement, Devon and Deviere were living together and building a domestic life around the two daughters Devon shared with Jonathan. Jonathan held full physical custody of those children, and they had been staying at the home of his mother, Yoko Willett. Plans were being made, as of early August 2023, for Jonathan to move into Devon's Las Vegas home, bringing the children their belongings and himself into the household. The day before the fatal events, Jonathan had reportedly proposed to Devon, suggesting they rebuild what they had once had. To prosecutors, this was the motive. Jonathan's arrival would upend everything. It would bring the father into the same domestic space as the son. It would threaten the life Devon had built with Deviere. And according to the prosecution, Devon had decided that the disruption was not going to happen. On the evening of August 6, 2023, Devon drove to the Henderson home of Yoko Willett on Palo Duro Drive, where Jonathan was staying. Surveillance footage placed her arrival around 8 in the evening. The two left together briefly in his truck for a stop at a gas station before returning to the house. Jonathan had been drinking that evening, but was functional and unaware of the danger in his own bedroom. Later that night, Devon offered him a massage. Jonathan lay face down on his bed in his own home, relaxed and trusting. While he was in that position, face down, vulnerable, completely off guard, Devon retrieved a wooden object from the fireplace area of the room. She described it in a later police interview as candlestick-like. She struck him on the head with it. He went limp. Yoko, awake elsewhere in the home, heard a strange dropping sound around 2 in the morning. At 2:04, surveillance cameras captured Devon leaving the house. She carried items with her. She drove away. What Devon left behind was documented in painstaking forensic detail. Jonathan's body had been subjected to far more than the initial blow. Post-mortem forensic examination confirmed that his head had been severed from his body using 2 instruments, a hand-powered cutting tool and a mechanically powered saw. Cut marks on the cervical vertebrae indicated multiple attempts before a clean severance was achieved. The bedding showed minimal evidence of a struggle, which was consistent with the attack having occurred while he was already unconscious and incapable of resisting. He had not even known what was being done to him. Chemicals were poured over his body after the fact, ammonia and bleach, which combined to produce toxic fumes and cause burns across the remains. His body was wrapped in blankets. A pillow had been placed beneath his torso. His personal items, wallet, keys, phone, social security card, were gone from the scene. His phone was later found in Devon's vehicle, with traces of blood on it. Additional items tied to him were discovered during a search of her home, including materials stored in a bag hidden in her underwear drawer. His head was never recovered. Investigators believed it had been removed from the scene and disposed of in trash near her northwest Las Vegas home. Yoko discovered the scene around 8 the following morning, overwhelmed by a powerful chemical odor. She called emergency services. Digital forensics and surveillance records tracked Devon's movements through the night, establishing a precise timeline that placed her at the scene during the relevant window and connected her to the missing items. Devon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In 2024, she entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder, a deal that could have resulted in parole eligibility after roughly 15 years. But at a sentencing hearing, she broke down, expressed apology, and then almost immediately reversed herself, claimed she was innocent, and withdrew the plea. A full jury trial became necessary as a result. The 2-week trial in November 2025 included forensic testimony about the chemical treatment of the body, analysis of the cut marks on the vertebrae, digital tracking evidence, and the full reconstruction of the complex family dynamics at the center of the case. The defense argued that Deviere, Jonathan's own son, had committed the act, pointing to his access to power tools through his job, his resentment toward his father, and what they characterized as gaps in the investigation. Deviere testified under oath, denied involvement, admitted to the relationship with Devon, and attributed his initial lies to police to embarrassment. The prosecution used GPS and phone data to establish that Deviere was home with the children throughout the relevant period. The jury convicted Devin of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon. On January 8, 2026, Judge Tiara Jones sentenced her to 20 years to life for the murder plus a consecutive 8 to 20 years for the deadly weapon enhancement, a minimum of 28 years before parole eligibility. No death penalty was sought. Jonathan Willett was 46 years old. He was a father. He had been planning to come home, to rebuild something, to be present for his children. He went to his mother's house on the evening of August 6th, lay down on his bed, and trusted the person in the room with him. He never got back up, and his daughters, the children he had loved and raised, were left to grow up carrying the knowledge of what happened to him. Toni Collette Fratto. Jealousy is one of the most well-documented human emotions. Every person with a beating heart has experienced some version of it. The low, uncomfortable ache that comes from feeling threatened by someone else's presence in a relationship. Most people feel it, acknowledge it, and allow it to dissolve on its own or address it through conversation. But in rare and terrible cases, jealousy does not dissolve. It concentrates. It hardens. And in the most extreme instances, it transforms into something that cannot be reversed. Toni Collette Fratto was 19 years old in the spring of 2011. She lived in the small, close-knit town of West Wendover, Nevada, a community near the Utah border, modest in size and tight in the way that small towns tend to be, where everyone knows everyone and social circles overlap constantly. Toni was in a relationship with Cody Cree Patton, also 19, and by accounts from their community, the two were deeply enmeshed, with talk of eventual marriage circulating among people who knew them. They had built, in the way young couples do, an identity around being together, and Toni had no intention of allowing anything to threaten it. Micaela Costanzo, known to those around her as Mickey, was 16 years old. She was a classmate, a childhood acquaintance, and in Toni's mind, a rival. Mickey and Cody had shared some form of prior connection, a friendship, a flirtation, a history that Toni had never been able to set aside. Phone records from the day of March 3, 2011, showed that Mickey had been texting and calling Cody repeatedly after school. Whether she was expressing interest, seeking a conversation, or simply staying in contact with someone she had known for years, the effect on Toni was explosive. Toni had reportedly bullied Mickey before. She had expressed in what would later be described as diary entries a level of hatred toward the younger girl that went far beyond ordinary rivalry. These were not the private frustrations of a jealous teenager working through difficult feelings. They were declarations of intent, written reflections of a mind that had already decided Mickey's continued existence in their world was unacceptable. She did not simply want Cody to distance himself from Mickey. She wanted Mickey gone permanently. On the afternoon of March 3, 2011, Toni and Cody moved. They located Mickey after school and got her into their vehicle. Whether Mickey came willingly, perhaps believing this was simply a conversation that needed to happen, or was compelled, she ended up in that car, and they drove her out of West Wendover, away from the school, away from the town, into the open desert landscape near the Utah-Nevada border, several miles from any help, several miles from anyone who could intervene. Once they reached the remote location, Toni acted first. She had brought a camping shovel. She used it to strike Mickey in the back of the head, delivering blunt force trauma from behind, from a direction Mickey would never have anticipated a blow coming from. The 16-year-old went down, and then Toni did something that strips away any last argument about impulse or panic. She sat down on Mickey's legs. She physically pinned her there. She held her in place deliberately, preventing her from moving or escaping, while Cody produced a knife and cut Mickey's throat, severing the blood vessels that would have been her only remaining chance at survival. Mickey Costanzo bled to death in the Nevada desert, restrained by the girl who resented her, killed by the boy she had apparently cared about. After it was over, Toni and Cody used that same shovel to dig a shallow grave in the desert sand and buried Mickey's body before driving back toward town. They had brought the tools. They had chosen the location. They had come prepared to do exactly what they did and to leave no visible trace of it behind. Mickey's absence was noticed. Her disappearance triggered a search. Phone records linking her to Cody helped investigators focus their inquiry. Days later, the body was discovered. Toni was not initially a primary suspect, but she ultimately came forward to Cody's attorneys with a confession that detailed her own role in the attack, a confession that had not been compelled by privilege and could therefore be used. She was arrested on May 5, 2011. Toni initially faced open murder charges, including a first-degree count that carried the possibility of the death penalty in Nevada. She avoided that outcome through a plea agreement. On January 27, 2012, she pled guilty to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon enhancement, agreeing to testify against Cody in exchange for the reduced charge. On April 16, 2012, Judge Daniel Papez sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years, the maximum available under the terms of the plea. He described the murder as among the most violent he had encountered across his entire judicial career. Cody, who had initially considered a similar deal, eventually pled guilty to first-degree murder and received life without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, he attempted to rewrite the record, claiming Toni had been the one to inflict the fatal wound. The judge rejected that entirely as a last-minute revision designed to minimize his own accountability. The community of West Wendover was left with an absence that could not be filled. Nikki Costanzo was 16 years old. She had done nothing wrong in any moral or meaningful sense. She may have texted a boy too many times, and that was the totality of her offense against the person who decided she had to be removed from the world. Toni's parole bid in 2021 was denied. She remains incarcerated in a Nevada women's facility. Mickey's family has lived in the years since, with the knowledge of what those final moments looked like. Their daughter in a desert, held down, unable to escape, at the hands of people who had once been part of her school, her town, her ordinary life. That is what jealousy looked like at its most extreme. Not an argument, not a breakup, a camping shovel, a shallow grave, and a 16-year-old girl who never came home. Brenda Stokes Wilson. Trust is one of the most fragile things a human being can offer another person. It is built slowly, through consistent behavior and shared time, through small acts of reliability stacked on top of one another until the architecture feels solid. And the most catastrophic betrayals are always the ones that come from someone who had every opportunity to observe that trust being built and deliberately chose to weaponize it. Brenda Stokes Wilson was 50 years old on December 21, 2012. She was a blackjack dealer at the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada, and had once been engaged to Philip Morris, a man she had dated for several years. That relationship had ended, but something about Brenda had not moved forward in the way that a person should when a chapter of their life closes. She remained in contact with the family. She had maintained enough of a presence in their lives that Jade Morris, Philip's 10-year-old daughter, knew her, trusted her, and thought of her as a familiar, safe adult. Jade's mother, Tawana Reeves, felt the same. The trust had been built slowly, across years, through all the ordinary interactions that make a person feel reliable. Brenda had been in their home. She had been around that child. And she had been watching that trust accumulate, never indicating, not once, what she intended to do with it. On the afternoon of December 21, 2012, Brenda arrived at Tawana's home around 4:50. She was driving a borrowed red 2007 four-door Saab. She was dressed ordinarily. She spoke normally. She told Tawana she was taking Jade Christmas shopping. Jade was 10 years old. She was excited. She climbed into that car without a second thought in the world, because she had no reason to have one. Jade's father was out of town. Tawana watched the car pull away. Brenda did not drive to any store. She did not take Jade shopping. She drove the child to a remote vacant lot in a desert area near the 215 Beltway and 5th Street in North Las Vegas, an isolated, unpopulated place, far from the streets and the people who might have helped. There she took a knife and attacked 10-year-old Jade Morris, stabbing her multiple times. Jade died from those wounds in that vacant lot, alone with the woman her family had trusted, not far from the home she had left earlier that afternoon, expecting to have a good day. Brenda left the body there and drove back toward the Strip. That same evening, around 10 o'clock, she walked into the Bellagio and approached a blackjack table where her co-worker Joyce Roan, 44 years old, was in the middle of a shift. Brenda produced a straight razor and slashed Joyce across the face multiple times, causing severe lacerations. Casino security reached her before she could do more. She was arrested at the Bellagio that night. Later, in statements to police, she acknowledged that had security not intervened, she would have taken Joyce's life. She said it plainly. It was not a threat made in anger. It was a statement of fact delivered without visible remorse. Think about the timeline of that day. Jade Morris in the morning. A child she had known for years, trusted by her mother, handed over for a Christmas shopping outing. Jade dead in a vacant lot in the desert by late afternoon. And then Brenda driving to a casino, walking across the floor, finding Joyce at her table, and doing what she had gone there to do. Two separate acts of violence in the same afternoon and evening. Two different victims. The same person behind both. And somewhere in all of it, Philip Morris was out of town, entirely unaware that his daughter had been taken from the world. Jade's body was discovered approximately a week later when a man walking his dog came across it in the vacant lot. The Clark County coroner confirmed multiple stab wounds as the cause of death. Evidence recovered from Brenda's possession, including bloody clothing and traces in the vehicle, connected her directly to both the murder and the attack on Joyce. She had been arrested at the Bellagio on the evening of the crime. The connection to Jade's disappearance came together quickly as investigators worked backward through the day. A grand jury indicted Brenda in February 2013 on multiple counts. She entered a not guilty plea at early hearings. Then, in January 2016, more than 3 years after the crimes, she agreed to plead guilty to all charges. First-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon. First-degree kidnapping with use of a deadly weapon. Attempted murder with use of a deadly weapon. Burglary while in possession of a deadly weapon, and mayhem with use of a deadly weapon. She accepted the maximum punishment on each count and waived all appeal rights as a condition of the agreement. In April of 2016, she attempted to withdraw that plea, claiming she had been rushed into it by previous counsel and had not understood the full implications. Clark County District Court Judge Kathleen Delaney held a hearing, reviewed the circumstances, found no valid grounds for withdrawal, denied the motion, and proceeded to sentencing on May 16, 2016. Brenda Stokes Wilson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Jade's mother, Tawana, and her grandmother delivered statements that described what it meant to lose a 10-year-old child to the hands of someone the family had invited into their lives. They described the holiday seasons that had been altered permanently. They described the specific cruelty of the timing, 3 days before Christmas. A little girl excited about shopping, a mother who waved goodbye without knowing. Philip Morris had trusted Brenda with his daughter. He returned from his trip to a world in which Jade no longer existed. There is no sentence that restores what was taken on December 21, 2012. There is no verdict that answers 10 years of a child's life, or the decades of grief that follow. What Brenda Stokes Wilson received was life without parole. That is the ceiling of what the law offered. And it remains, in the most honest sense, profoundly and permanently insufficient. Amy Deschant. There is a certain kind of predator who does not look predatory at all. They look like entrepreneurs. They look industrious and capable. People who built something from scratch and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of someone who has figured out how to make their way in the world. Their danger is not visible in their demeanor. It is buried beneath the surface, revealed only by the choices they make when opportunity and desperation converge at the same crossroads. Amy Deschant arrived in Las Vegas in the early 1990s, having operated similar businesses elsewhere, and established a carpet cleaning company. She was industrious, practical, and experienced at running an operation. She hired employees, built client relationships, and moved through her professional world with competence. Among her employees were a woman named Claudia McClure and a man named Robert Wayne Jones, known to those around him as Bobby, who was described as financially struggling, somewhat aimless, and largely loyal to Amy in the unquestioning way of a person who does not have many other anchors. In October of 1995, Amy met Bruce Weinstein, 46 years old, a professional gambler and bookmaker who operated an illegal betting operation out of his home. Bruce was not shy about the cash his business generated. He kept large sums, over $100,000 at times, readily accessible at his residence. Within a short time, Amy and Bruce became romantically involved and she moved in with him. From the outside, it looked like two unconventional people finding common ground. From the inside, prosecutors would later argue, Amy was running a very different kind of calculation. By July of 1996, prosecutors alleged Amy had settled on a plan. Bruce's cash, the money sitting in his home, generated by his bookmaking operation, represented an opportunity that she had decided to pursue. She allegedly brought Bobby into the scheme. Bobby, with few financial resources and considerable loyalty to Amy, provided a .380 caliber firearm. The plan, as prosecutors argued it, was to rob Bruce Weinstein and ensure that there would be no witness remaining to report what had happened. On or around July 5, 1996, Bruce was shot in his bed at his Las Vegas home. A neighbor heard what sounded like 3 distinct popping sounds that night, initially dismissing them as fireworks given the proximity to the Independence Day holiday. Bruce Weinstein did not survive. What followed was a meticulous, professional cleanup, and that detail is what made this case so chilling in its specificity. Amy owned a carpet cleaning business. She had the knowledge, the equipment, and the practical experience to understand how to remove biological evidence from fabric surfaces. She applied that expertise directly to the crime scene. Bloody carpeting was removed. The area was treated. The evidence of what had occurred was methodically addressed by the very professional skills Amy had spent years developing. Bobby assisted in the removal and disposal of Bruce's body. The remains were transported approximately 80 miles northeast of Las Vegas to an isolated desert area near Mesquite, Nevada, close to the Arizona border. The body was placed in a shallow grave and covered with stones and rocks. No marker, no acknowledgement, just the open desert and a carefully constructed concealment. Hunters discovered Bruce's decomposed remains on August 11, 1996, approximately a month after his disappearance. The autopsy confirmed a gunshot wound. A .380 caliber bullet was recovered. A firearm of the same caliber, rusty from prolonged exposure to the elements, was later found in the desert. The chain of physical evidence began to assemble itself. When investigators closed in, Amy ran. She was stopped for a traffic violation in Maryland, posted bond and vanished again. She resurfaced, ultimately, at a nudist colony in Florida, a place called Sunnier Days, where she was arrested in January of 1998 after being featured on the television program America's Most Wanted as its 500th captured fugitive. Bobby had also fled to New Mexico and was apprehended separately. Amy's 1998 trial resulted in a first-degree murder conviction and 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 12 years on a robbery charge. Bobby received 5 years for his role as an accessory, but the conviction did not stand. In 2000, the Nevada Supreme Court overturned Amy's verdict, ruling that a former homicide detective's characterization of her organized crime story as a fairy tale was improper opinion testimony that had unfairly influenced the jury. The court ordered a new trial. Prosecutors opted for a plea agreement rather than a full retrial. In 2001, Amy pled guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 10 to 25 years, with credit for the approximately 3.5 years she had already served. She applied for parole in 2007, denied, and again in 2010, granted. She was released in July 2011, having served a total of approximately 13 years. Bruce Weinstein had been 59 years old at the time of his death. He was not a perfect man. His business operated in the shadows of legality, and the world he inhabited carried its own risks. But none of that justified what was done to him. He trusted the woman he had allowed into his home and his life, and she had stood in his home, calculated his worth in cash, and made the decision that he needed to disappear. That is the truth at the center of this case. Not organized crime, not mob intervention, just a woman who knew how to clean up a mess and decided that the man she was living with was one she could afford to make. Jill Rockcastle. Wealth has a way of concealing dysfunction. The luxury condominium, the poker tournaments, the lifestyle that photographs beautifully and tells a story of success All of it can serve as insulation against the uncomfortable truth that, behind the polished exterior, something is deeply, irrevocably wrong. And when that truth finally surfaces, it often does so in a way that no amount of carefully maintained image can contain. Jill Rockcastle was born in 1958 and was 49 years old on April 13, 2007. Her husband, William Bill Gustafik, was 44, a former chiropractor who had transitioned into the world of professional poker, operating under the table nickname The Manipulator. They lived in a luxury condominium at the Panorama Towers on Dean Martin Drive, not far from the Las Vegas Strip. From the outside, it was the glamorous life. From the inside, Jill would later write, it was something else entirely. In the days leading up to the night of April 13th, the couple was navigating what Jill later described as an unbearable accumulation of pressure. In a 10-page document she would compose and send before attempting to end her own life days later, she outlined a relationship consumed by financial deception. She described cheating on taxes, defrauding business associates, and maintaining an extravagant lifestyle held up entirely by borrowed money and calculated lies. She wrote about constantly dodging bill collectors and hiding the reality of their finances behind the appearance of prosperity. She described needing to deliver $30,000 for an upcoming poker tournament, money she did not have, and arriving back in Las Vegas, already afraid of Bill's reaction to that failure. She also alleged that Bill had threatened to harm her, including a threat to her life the day before the stabbing. She claimed he had become physically abusive over time. She described a long-standing environment of fear and instability. She even alleged, in that same letter, that Bill had once attempted to arrange for someone to harm his ex-wife to prevent her from pursuing custody of their daughter, so that he could simply hire a nanny and continue his poker career unburdened. Whether that particular claim was ever independently corroborated remains unclear from public reporting. But it was part of the portrait Jill painted, a man operating without ethical guardrails and without fear of consequences, and a woman who had been living in the shadow of that man for years. Jill framed everything that followed as the desperate act of a woman who had finally run out of options. What is documented is this. On the night of April 13, 2007, in the bedroom of their Panorama Towers condominium, an argument erupted between Jill and Bill. She claimed he threatened to kill her during that confrontation, that the fear she had been accumulating for years reached its peak in those moments. In a state of panic, she reached for a knife, and then she stabbed him, not once, more than a dozen times. The attack was frenzied, concentrated, and fatal. Bill Gustafik died in the bedroom from multiple stab wounds. He was 44 years old. After the attack, Jill did not call for help. She cleaned the scene, at least partially, composing herself enough to address the physical evidence before she left the apartment. Then she drove out of Nevada entirely, heading to California. She checked into the Petit Soleil bed and breakfast in San Luis Obispo, and before or around the time of her arrival there, she composed a 10-page email and sent it to friends, family, and acquaintances. In it, she confessed to the killing and framed it as self-defense. She disclosed the financial deceptions. She expressed remorse for the harm she and Bill had caused others through their lifestyle of fraud. She described the act of writing the letter itself as her version of a final accounting, a reckoning she was choosing to make before she exited, completely. Authorities in San Luis Obispo found her unconscious at the bed and breakfast around noon on April 16th, several days after the killing. She was hospitalized and then moved to police custody. Extradition to Nevada followed on May 4th, 2007. Las Vegas police charged her with murder, with use of a deadly weapon, and a grand jury later indicted her on that charge. She was held without bail at the Clark County Detention Center. The investigation and the email together created an unusual evidentiary picture. Her own words had placed her at the scene, confirmed the act, and provided her stated motive. The question before the courts was not whether she had done it. She had acknowledged that clearly, but how to classify it and what sentence it warranted. On September 16, 2008, Jill entered a no-contest plea, an Alford plea, to second-degree murder. She acknowledged that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict her without fully admitting guilt. At her sentencing on November 19, 2008, Clark County District Court Judge Michael Villani heard her say she was not a violent person and had simply lost control. He sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. She avoided a first-degree murder charge and its harsher potential consequences largely because of the plea agreement and because the domestic context, the claims of sustained fear, abuse, and emotional desperation influenced how the case was ultimately resolved. No death penalty was ever considered. Nevada law at the time allowed second-degree murder to carry a sentence of 10 years to life, and the deal reflected that range. Bill Gustafik did not survive to offer his account of the marriage, the finances, or the allegations Jill raised in her letter. He left behind only the 44 years he had lived and the questions that would never be fully answered. Whatever the full truth of their relationship, the end came in a luxury bedroom overlooking Las Vegas, in a building that had probably seen a great many secrets. His was just one of them. Jill Rockcastle remained incarcerated in Nevada. As of available records through at least 2023, she had not been released. She served her sentence at Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center, where she reportedly participated in an animal care program with dogs. Whether she has since been granted parole remains unclear. What is clear is that the polished Las Vegas life she and Bill had constructed, built on debt and deception, ended the night she picked up that knife, and the cost of that ending was measured in decades behind bars.